hello to everybody and your food comas. It's really nice to be here at AWE, seeing so many faces in person that I have followed on Twitter for the last 4 or 5 years. My name is Britton Heller. I am counsel at, I am a fellow at the Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. I run a human rights and technology law and consulting practice, and I've been working in XR for about 5 years now. I like to tell people I am the lawyer of the Black Mirror. So we have 3 wonderful experts on our panel today to talk about how we can build effective and safe communities in XR. I've decided to let the panelists introduce themselves very briefly because it's nicer to get to know them that way. So Queenie, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so my name is Queenie, Queenie Wong. I'm a reporter at CNET, and I cover social media companies, so that includes Meta, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok, and a bunch of, the list just seems to be growing. So I've been following these companies since 2015, and before that I've also covered education, crime, and politics, and so I've seen some of the best sides of humanity as a reporter, but also some of the worst sides. And I did a very in-depth story about harassment in VR back in December.
I'm Jordan Fieulleteau. I'm a policy manager at Meta, specifically Reality Labs, and I work on AR and VR policy.
And I am Jessica Outlaw. I am the founder of The Extended Mind, which is a research agency based in Portland, Oregon. And it's nice to see a lot of familiar faces. My history is I'm a behavioral scientist, and I've always been interested in how cues in the environment can influence people's behavior, especially in ways that are outside of their conscious awareness. And so when I got my first VR demo in 2016, it was just the potential simulations that we could all be living in the future. It attracted me as a research topic, and I've been here ever since.
All right, so I'd like to give a trigger warning to the audience. We are going to be talking about some of the online harms that people experience in AR, VR, so you may hear adult language, you may hear us describe distressing situations. Please feel free to get up and leave if that is your choice, but just so you know, that's what we're gonna cover, because you can't talk about how to make people behave better without discussing very frankly how things can go wrong. So let's start with Jordan. Jordan, what is the metaverse, and what are the major differences you see from a policy perspective between AR and VR? I'm saying this because we have some journalists here, we have a lot of professionals here, but I want to make sure we're all on the same, the same sort of basic knowledge.
Yeah, so I get that question a lot. I think of the metaverse as kind of like the next step in, the evolving internet. So we had dial-up internet. Today we have 2D screens, we have smartphones, we have laptops, and the metaverse is kind of like the next step in that process. The metaverse is going to, I think, present a lot of new opportunities that just aren't available today to a lot of people. It's going to be more immersive. And you're going to be able to interact with content and people in like ways that you haven't been able to before. But I think like one thing I really want to highlight is that we're really at the early stages of the metaverse. The metaverse is not built, and it's not only going to be built by Meta, it's going to be built in collaboration with industry folks, policymakers, civil society groups. So that's how I think of the metaverse. And then the major differences between AR and VR, I think AR is basically, content that's going to be layered on top of the real world. I think the really popular use cases people today are using, or you could think of like Instagram filters, or Pokemon Go is probably one of the most popular AR applications, and VR is a lot more embodied, it's more immersive. So that's how I think of AR and VR.
Mm-hmm. And so they have different hardware scapes as well, right?
Yes, so I would say the VR hardware landscape is more mature. You see a lot more mainstream use of VR. Of course, Meta, we have our Meta Quest headset. But you also see things like HTC, Microsoft HoloLens, PlayStation has their own, and VR or AR typically is used on smartphones right now. And then also, I guess the industry is moving towards like AR glasses, wearables. But right now that technology isn't built and is not really like mainstream yet. And I know there's a lot of technical hurdles that have to be leaped over, I guess you could say, to get to a point where AR glasses and AR technology is a lot more mainstream as it relates to wearables.
One of the things I think is interesting about the evolving hardware scape between AR and VR is that it brings up different problems. You have different risk factors when you're looking at different form factors of technology and how people use that to mediate their social experiences. So now that we've set the stage, let's go into discussing some of these problems. Queenie, you talked about this report you did, and it was very widely publicized. It was great reporting. What are some of the safety risks and challenges that you've heard from users in VR?
So as a reporter, I've talked to victims of harassment. I've also been in some of these spaces myself and have seen people get harassed. And I've also, as a woman in these spaces, I've had some questionable things happen to me as well. And so for this story, I actually interviewed a 20-year-old user of Echo VR. And Echo VR is this virtual reality ultimate frisbee game where everyone's kind of floating in zero gravity. You're split into two teams, and the object of the game is to get the disc to the other side of kind of sort of like football, but with like a disc. And so she had been playing this game, and one thing that was sort of the tipping point that really bothered her was she had always been very hesitant to talk in Echo VR because she's a woman, and she knows that once somebody hears her voice in a very male-dominated space, that could provoke somebody to come say something to her. And so one day she said she was playing the game, and she just cursed out of frustration, like she said the F word, and somebody said, I'm gonna record your voice and masturbate to it. And so that really bugged her because it was just a culmination of events that happened. And I've heard so many stories since then, and if you look at the reviews of some of these apps and on social media, there's been many complaints about these issues. And I've seen it firsthand myself, just being in these spaces, because I don't only look at what users tell me, but I go into these spaces myself, and I've seen situations where people, say things like, and it seems like it's unprovoked, like somebody has a voice changer on in Echo VR and they don't know how to turn it off, and somebody says like go shove a dick down your throat. Like those are the type of comments that you get in VR if you're a woman, or if sometimes if you're a minority, ethnic slurs are said in VR. And so I think what's really different is this sense of presence. Because when I talk to these people, it does feel real to them. And the other side of it is it's really hard to report this because there's not a digital trail left behind where you can say, look at this Facebook post, or look at this photo, or whatever somebody sent me. You have to record it somehow in the moment. And if you didn't catch it in a recording, then the form asks you to submit some form of evidence. And so the person I talked to, she said she actually didn't report it because she didn't catch it in a recording. And she also had a very hard time figuring out who was talking in this space because in Echo VR, everyone's a robot. So they all look the same, like pretty much. And they have screen names on the top of their head, but sometimes they're floating around in zero gravity. So if you thought reporting harassment in social media was hard, try reporting harassment as somebody's floating around in zero gravity and there's so much movement involved. And so that's some of the issues that I've seen, like personally, just being a reporter covering this issue.
Jessica, you did a study back, was it in 2016? About 2017, excuse me, about harassment in VR, what were some of the things that you found that kind of resonate with what Queenie said?
Yeah, so the title of my study was about women's first-time experiences in social VR, and there were strategies that women employed in the virtual worlds that they visited in 2017 that that women use in the physical world to avoid harassment. So some of the things that I saw were not speaking, so that one came up. Another one was the choice of avatars and choosing like gender neutral or male avatars in order to avoid attracting attention. And the third one was behavioral, where if there was a group of avatars all standing together, the women would strategically like teleport or walk around the perimeter of the groups to avoid attracting attention, which is another strategy that women use in the physical world. And the way that early study influenced my work is that I like started to believe early on that the behavioral patterns that we learn in the physical world, we're just necessarily going to bring them into the virtual worlds unless there's additional scaffolding or additional ways of learning, et cetera.
So this seems to translate onto VR. We've talked about VR. How does this change in AR? I know that a couple of the companies that I've worked with have been very concerned about impersonation-based harms in AR and issues about authenticating your identity when you are an avatar or a digital representation. How do you know the person you're talking to is who they appear to be? And if you are to authenticate them using biometrics or other type of information like that, how do you keep that identity secure from being hacked, stolen, or misrepresented? One of the things that I'm concerned with is the inadvertent creation of stalkerware, meaning that we focus so much on creating beautiful experiences that really engage people. And AR, I think, is designed to connect us in the real world through these digital overlays. And when it's at its best, that's what it does. But if you're creating a real-time map of my location, I don't necessarily want everyone to know where I am at all times and the type of patterns that emerge from when I go to work, when I go to the grocery store, when I go to the doctor, when I'm sitting in my living room, and have those associated with me uniquely. So I think personal identifying information is actually more of a concern in augmented reality than in virtual reality at this point, but it could change with pass-through. Jessica, I think you had something that you wanted to add about location-based harassment.
Yeah, following up on the impersonation. So one of the things that, like Britton has this typology that I've adopted, which is about what are the ways that VR and AR may be different, because it has like the interactivity of gaming. It has the online to offline, like matching the way that dating apps do. And then there's that rapidity and like synchronicity of communication that happens. And there's an example from a dating app where an ex-boyfriend set up a fake profile, like multiple fake profiles for his ex on Grindr. And what happened is like 1,000 men came to this one person's workplace they came to his work or his home seeking sex. And it was just an example of how, you know, the ex had his ex-boyfriend's home address, he had his work location, and just like, even though the person kept reporting over and over, like, I'm being impersonated, that is not my profile, like, please help. Like, it was just this example of somebody who like was extremely motivated to game the system. And I think there's a way that like what can we learn from this extreme edge case where like this was clearly like a very bad breakup, and like most people aren't going to be that motivated to create like create fake profiles and do something like of repeated harm over and over. So when I think about like what is one potential future for augmented reality, like the ways in which the online to offline harms could be amplified seem additionally risky. So like somebody could paint graffiti on my house that could only be visible through certain AR apps, but would be invisible to me. And I think there's things that we can learn from how dating apps are having to make content moderation decisions today that could inform AR, like the types of location-based content that, like these types of decisions are probably going to have come up again in the AR context.
I think pinning that to content moderation is a really salient point. So content moderation in digital worlds is kind of what this all boils down to at the core. Jordan, can you explain to us what content moderation looks like in practice to kind of across the industry? You don't have to get so specific, but how does it work at this phase?
Yeah, thank you, Britton. So I'll speak to what we do at Meta. I can't really speak to what some of the other companies out there do, but I guess Horizon Worlds is kind of the best example I can use today. And for those that don't know, Horizon Worlds is our social VR platform where basically you can party up with friends, you can create worlds, you can create experiences, you can attend live events, etc. And basically the way content moderation works, or I guess it's a mix of content and conduct moderation, is we have the standard block and mute, and then you also can report not only users, but also content. Additionally, on top of that, we have community guides, which basically are people that welcome you into Horizon Worlds when you first, I guess, go through the new user experience and basically show you the lay of the land. They can tell you how to change and toggle your settings. They can also show you which worlds are the most popular or different worlds that might pique your interest. And then lastly, we also have what we call moderators or live moderators that basically say, for example, me and Queenie are in a world and I report Queenie for doing something. A queue is needed as a prerequisite to send a live moderator there. And then a live moderator would be able to enforce and take action against Queenie if she was harassing me or bullying me or et cetera, or if I blocked or reported them and the live moderator saw that it was unjustified, they would be able to see that by being in the setting. And then lastly, we also have what we call poll to remove, where basically if somebody's in a space and they're being disruptive, we have the ability to, or I guess users in that instance of a world have the ability to vote, but it would have to be majority. So if there was 8 people, it would have to be 5 people that voted to remove that person. And that's basically to help, I guess, kind of have a community buy-in before somebody is like kicked out of a world. But yeah, content moderation generally in Horizon Worlds looks differently depending on, I guess, the level of harassment that you're facing.
So Queenie, from your experience, it sounds like you were dealing head on with some of these content moderation challenges, right? Can you speak a little bit more deeply about that? Maybe the importance of context or interoperability?
Yeah, I mean, so content moderation has always been a challenging issue, not only on like regular social media, but also in these spaces. And, you know, sometimes certain ethnic slurs are reclaimed, and you can't always rely on words that are spoken, but there's also gestures, like somebody has given me the middle finger in, VR for I don't know what reason. So there are some of those challenges. And actually one interesting thing that happened, because I talked to the CEO of Rec Room, which was another space I was looking at. It's similar to Horizon Worlds. They also have a voting mechanism where you can vote to kick out a player if they're being disruptive. But he was saying that they were rolling out automated voice moderation. And so I guess it would be some AI-powered system that would look or hear certain words. And the idea behind that was kind of taking the burden away from the user, because when you're in a situation where you're being harassed, if anyone has been in that situation, it's very like jarring. Like you don't remember like you don't remember you don't remember like where the mute button is. You don't remember. You're confused, and so a lot of the shift that I've seen is putting the control in the hands of the user because, but trying to do so maybe in a way that isn't so burdensome, but also using some sort of automated mechanism where if they can't do something in the moment because they honestly don't remember, they're just, emotionally charged, then other players can kind of kick in. So like either something automated or other users in the room helping out, or like you mentioned, like live moderators. Those are some of the different things that I've seen companies look at.
A lot of the work I do focuses on the difference between content moderation in web to social media and what content moderation could look like in AR, VR digital worlds. And one of the main differences that I see is that Web 2 is about actors, behaviors, and content, and really, really looking at content and conduct. It is text-based, so you can apply AI-based mechanisms to govern it. And most content moderation, and the most effective way to do it at scale, is to run it through AI. Those systems don't really exist yet in AR and VR. So if anyone's looking for a new startup idea, that is a huge market hole that you'd get a lot of business on, and it would help a lot of people. But it has to be different. It can't just be like social media, because you have to look at content, conduct, and environment. We haven't really had what I like to think of as a YouTube moment in XR yet. And there's lots of players pushing towards that and giving you opportunities to create user-generated content. I think when user-generated content actually comes to the fray, then these content moderation challenges are really going to come to a head, because it's not just the way people will speak to each other. It's not just the way they will interact personally. It's the features, functionalities, and harms that can come from what they build. So this kind of leads me to another question. Is this type of behavior that we've been talking about a part of online gaming or online culture? Is it endemic to it, or is it just something that we're supposed to deal with? Or is it something we're supposed to correct?
I think people are trying to correct it. It was kind of sad to me because as I talked to people who have been harassed or they've witnessed harassment, there's almost like this sense of powerlessness because they feel as if this has been going on for so long, And like, if I report it, will anything get done? And because of that, I think, I would like to believe that there could be an improvement, Like, I know it's been a long-standing issue, but as more of these stories come out and as people work towards minimizing harassment, I would like to believe that things are getting better, because you do see new tools being rolled out, like personal bubbles by default, for example. So I'm kind of hopeful, but also I guess I'm hopeful and a skeptic as a journalist, because I have to be both. But yeah, it's been a long-standing issue, and I would like to believe that it's going to get better, even though the track record is not really that great.
Yeah, just to add to what Queenie said, I would say, gaming culture and the norms that I guess have been set over the course of many decades in gaming culture, I guess kind of spilled over or can spill over into AR and VR, just because many of the early adopters are likely people that are gamers. But that doesn't mean we can't help facilitate new norms and positive norms in AR and VR. And I think that's gonna, be companies like Meta and the bigger companies, but also working with people to help facilitate, positive norms, such as civil rights groups, accessibility groups, different people that have a stake in the game, because Sorry.
Somebody's popcorn's done?
Yeah, I think probably like an Amber Alert maybe. But back to what I was saying is, yes, I think the setting of positive norms while we're early in the development of the metaverse is going to be key to it being, a place that everybody wants to go to and spend time in. And I know, Jessica's done some research on the setting of positive norms and how that actually affects people in AR and VR spaces.
That's a good segue. So let's turn now to solutions, because we've talked about all the bad stuff, and if that's less interesting to me than what can be done to make things better, how we can make space for creativity and innovation, and really bring more people into this forum. So, Jessica, what are practical solutions to help protect users? How do you actually encourage positive behaviors in digital environments?
Yeah, there's a ton of examples. So, I mean, even just drawing on what the gaming industry has done, like has been like huge reliance on live moderators, especially in the history of MMOs. Another example is like small developers can do a lot on their own. Like there was this one developer who was just really excited about a particular online game called Destiny. And he knew that it was a problem where women were getting harassed. And so he basically made it possible for people to join guilds of like 100 people. So you could, 100 people in a guild was large enough that you could always have a full team on Destiny. Like it was big enough that you would be matched to people in your time zone, and there would be enough people in there that you could always have a full team to go on missions. And that made it possible for them to avoid, like for the people who joined those guilds to avoid like the larger public forums, and they weren't matched with strangers. They were matched with people where they saw the exact same people over and over and over again. And so I think there's a ton of examples there. I would also plug the IEEE VR just did a series of ethics in VR white papers that are coming out. I think they may have already come out either at the end of May or this week. And El Cortese and I are co-authors along with Tommy Erickson and Sarah Carbonneau on safety in social VR. And there's a whole list of design guidelines that you can find in there. And if anybody wants the link to that IEEE chapter, I will put it on Twitter today, or you can come up to me afterwards and I can get you a copy of that PDF. And there's a ton of resources out there. And I think when it comes to the setting of social norms, one thing that I heard in that story that Queenie told about Echo VR is that it sounds like it's like a little bit of like a high stress game. It's very competitive. It's designed. It's designed with like a specific purpose in mind. And I think there's something about like what sort of behaviors are you encouraging from those players? Like if you're trying to get people who are like hyper competitive and feel like very, very strongly about winning, like at what cost, like would they be so obsessed with like winning that they're less interested in like collaboration or like care for others? So I think there's a lot around like the behavioral patterns that are set, and how do you and like yeah, some people just love like high stakes competitive games. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think that it like I use the activities inside of VR or like to judge like how am I being encouraged, how is my behavior being influenced, like who are the heroes of the space, who are the people that get talked about the most, and like there's just so much that drives the norms of behavior that is inside the IEEE paper. I'm not going to go through every element of it right now. But yeah, I think there's a ton that can be done and a ton of lessons that can be learned from the years of gaming.
I think there's also lessons that we can draw in from design and from other aspects of public safety. I wrote an op-ed for The Information last month, and it was called "We Need a 911 for the Metaverse." And essentially, it points out some of the stories like Queenie has pointed out, where when you want to report something, it really needs to be a reflex. And if you went to a city and 911 was a different number in every city you went to, and in certain places you had to use a cell phone, and in certain places you had to write in, and in certain places you had to go in person, and in other places you had to text, you would never use those public safety mechanisms because you wouldn't know what to expect. And I think that's the phase we're at in the industry right now, where every experience, even within the same platform, has different types of safety reporting mechanisms. Some are at your head, some are always at your feet, some are over the other person, some are over you, some are on your wrist like an invisible watch. So step one is to try to standardize things within platforms. And step two is to try to translate it across the industry, because people will use it if it's more like a reflex. I think it's not a user education problem. If you look at the example of the woman who reported being harassed in December, she's a VP at an XR education company. She goes into VR all the time, every day for her work. Many people tried to portray her as a newcomer to the space or someone who just wasn't educated, and that wasn't so. She and I did an interview and talked about how she just felt overwhelmed by what was happening in the moment. And that's why 911 works. When there's something really overwhelming happening, you just know to call it. So emergency buttons, some sort of standardizing features that make it not like a user education failure, but more like a design challenge, I think would really help. Queenie, have you seen other examples from users or about design features that could be particularly useful in increasing safety?
So I have asked users, like, what would you like to see happen? And some of their solutions are quite simple. Like, for example, in Echo VR, she said it would be great if there was, because everyone's a robot, and I suppose it was designed in that way because it's sort of like a sports game where everyone's sort of wearing a uniform. If there was a better way to identify the players, then that could help in reporting. I guess in sports games there are numbers, or when people dress up their avatars, they might look different. There's a lot of issues right now where people use the same avatars. And I've actually had a similar issue where there were two robots in front of me, and I thought one was talking to me, but when I looked back at the video, the troublemaking one was the one on the right. There were two, because they looked similar and they were both in front of me, I still had a hard time figuring out who was saying what, because it's different in real life where everyone's face there are distinct differences in everyone's face, and you are able to recognize who is who. But in VR, everyone's that same avatar. So some of it is simple solutions like that. I think maybe things will get better as these spaces get more diverse. Because if you go into some of these games, it is very male-dominated. And if there were more women in these spaces, maybe they would be more comfortable and people wouldn't feel like they're in some sort of boys' club where they can say whatever they think is cool among their guy friends or something like that. So those are some of the things they've talked to me personally about.
Can I add something?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because I think in some of the research that I've done around what is the experience of being a man and witnessing harassment occurring to other people inside of social VR, there's just a tremendous amount of discomfort and men actually not feeling like not knowing what to do and wanting to take action, but not entirely feeling capable of doing that. And so I think that there's a lot about like some of the stories we've told today about like, you know, like there's the perpetrator and there's the victim, but I think there could also be the people who are the enablers or who are actually like the upstanding bystanders who can go in. And so I think that's one thing that I would also like really encourage people to think about is instead of like that particular dyad of like the victim and the perpetrator, are there ways that you can empower like everyone in the space and train them on like these are the norms and this is how to follow the norms, and if you see people who aren't doing it, how do you do that? Because I have a lot of faith in the good of humanity and people wanting to do the right thing if they know how. And I think that's a whole other different version of content moderation that doesn't rely on, you know, the specific role of the moderator or on AI.
Let's talk a little more about AI, because we're trying to look at solutions. Jordan, what are some of the hurdles to automated content moderation at this point? Because a lot of people who aren't familiar with the architecture of these systems think companies should do more, companies could do more. Why doesn't AI work at this point?
So I'll go back to what you said earlier is that, you know, on 2D platforms, it's really text and sometimes video and image based. And the algorithms that are running on those text classifiers or image classifiers are, you know, pretty mature at a point where the AI can run without really much human intervention. Whereas like in VR right now, the technology just isn't there. And I think as we build for the metaverse and think, you know, 5 to 10 years down the road, content moderation is going to look a lot different than it does today. But right now, like the technology isn't there. And I think you gave a quick little plug earlier, but yeah, that's like a great startup idea because I think, you know, 3D classifiers are just like extremely difficult from like a technical perspective.
That's really interesting, and I hope somebody's taking notes who is an R&D director at a company and calls me afterwards. Queenie, what are some of the benefits of AI-based solutions?
So for me, it's hard to see like a solution that isn't multi-pronged. So AI is probably going to be a part of it, given how much research is being done in this space, and given the scale of the amount of users and the amount of interactions that happen in virtual worlds. But there's always also some sort of trade-off involved, right? When you push one solution versus the other. So for example, automated, you know, voice moderation, how many users are aware of that, recording, privacy concerns about that. So if you go too much on one side and you rely too much on computers, then maybe they're not sophisticated enough to understand the context. But if you rely too much on humans, one thing that has happened with human content moderators is that they've also complained that they've suffered like PTSD from viewing this amount of horrible content for a long time. So there's always a trade-off involved, but you know, these are tech companies. It's hard not to see them use technology as part of the solution, given the amount of like interactions, content being produced, and the amount of users that are going to be on these platforms.
Jessica, I've heard you before say that you're skeptical of AI solutions.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a way that like nobody wants to live in that Black Mirror episode where we're all essentialized to a single number. Like I think that is, if that's an Amber Alert, I really hope that like, it's like, okay.
It's us
So on
sounding the alarms of
yeah.
this issue.
Yeah, that is a little bit what it feels like. So on like skepticism of AI systems, like there's a way that by turning human behavior into like a quantifiable number or a quantifiable score, like there's ways that can certainly be gamed. So there's ways that like VR chat like it will assign you certain particular roles that's based on like how people interact with you, but their algorithm is purposely obtuse because you don't know exactly like which behaviors they're tracking and which they aren't, because they're really trying to avoid people the gaming that system of like being trusted or not trusted. So I think I certainly see a path forward, but this is partly why I wanted to insert that comment earlier about how if you're going to be looking at social spaces where there's groups of people, there's ways that you can empower people to actively moderate. Because like, you know, if the four of us went to dinner and Britton started picking on me, like I'm pretty sure that Queenie and Jordan would say something. Mm-hmm. And so I try to bring up that example because I think that's something that can happen a lot more in the moment. It's something that we all have experience with, and it's a muscle that we have. Like, how do you make that stronger? And I think that also goes to like product development. Like, what are these social places for? Who are they for? What type of behaviors do we want to encourage? Who is going to become valorized in these spaces? Are they going to be, you know, the people who are like the best players and the most competitive and the most cutthroat? Or are they going to be the people who look out for the others and make sure that people are included? And I think there's a lot when it comes to like the setting of the norms that you can do to influence. And because I think there's a way that like, that is something that could be done right away, and it's not something that you need to wait for the technology to evolve on.
Yeah. I always remind social media companies that they are creating reputational spaces. And I've done a lot of study about hate speech and how that permeates through online environments. And people are always surprised when I say anonymous speech does not encourage hateful speech. It's actually the social norms within the confines of the world that you create that will govern whether or not things are likely to go badly or people are likely to forego hate speech and bullying and harassment. Because in these spaces, even if you're using a screen name or a pseudonym, even if we all look like robots, you have a reputation within any sort of social group. And so if developers and designers can think about how to positively leverage that, the reputational economy of a digital world, and not turn it into a Black Mirror 5 stars type challenge, that will go a long way towards encouraging better user behavior, I think. We are about out of time, so I think I was just going to ask the panelists if they were to, with one or two words, pick the most important aspect they think people in the room should focus on to create better online communities. Go for it.
1 to 2 words?
1 to 2 words.
IEEE VR chapter on social VR.
I would say equity.
I would say diversity. If there's some employee in the room that says like, hey, we can't release these games because you consider everyone looks like a robot and it would be hard to report like somebody being harassed, like maybe we should do something, then that could prevent something from happening versus a reactive kind of approach where things are done after bad things have already happened.
And I'm going to say optimism.
Those are great words, and thank you so much for this amazing panel. And I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. Are there any audience questions? I have a feeling there's a ton. Okay, so he's coming up. Do you want to just take the mic and then I'll come right to you? You'll be next. Okay.
Hi. Thank you all. This is such a fascinating panel and all the incredible work that the four of you are doing. I'm interested in 2D social media, community standards and moderation policies, content policies also had an evolution. And a lot of those policies were added kind of reflexively to seeing a few years of harmful behavior. Maybe it's impersonation or blackface or Holocaust denial. Now we're at this early stage of VR, or social VR. What sort of community standards can be implemented now so that it wouldn't just be like reflexive several years down the road? Or other policies do you think about? I'll
take that if you don't mind me starting. I've been writing a lot of these policies with companies, and so there's a couple choices that you can make. One is thinking about how these 2D policies that are standardized translate into a kinetic environment. And to unprofessorize that for you, what does spam look like in VR? Anti-spam policies are a foundation of most content moderation systems. You have to think about the function and the purpose of these rules, not just the letter of these rules. And this is why I'm so sorry you're talking to a law professor right now. But what does spam do? Spam gums up the works. Spam prevents you from getting your emails. So I think a good corollary for an anti-spam policy would be prohibiting people from behavior that impedes usability of your virtual world. And that's very different than saying no spam. The other main decision point is if you're going to have a proactive or a reactive regime. For the real law nerds in the audience, it's like the difference between positive law and negative law regimes in the US and Europe. I see lots of blank stares, so just pretend I never said that. Are you going to have rules that encourage, that tell people what your expectations are as the creators and the types of behaviors you want to encourage? Or is it going to be more like a penal code? Do not, do not, do not. You shall not. So it's a difference between be respectful and don't use hate speech. One gives you a lot more leeway as a platform to work with evolving harms and evolving norms like you were talking about, because when people try to game the system, they do it very creatively, and it evolves over time. But the other one can be harmful in a different way, especially when you're doing content moderation in a way that context is hard to gauge. So it's really a choice that reflects the values of your platform. I know that sounds really kind of heal the world huggy-duggy, but it's really true. If you're a platform that allows white supremacists to kind of jaunt forward, you become a white supremacist platform. What you allow is what you stand for.
I definitely have seen differences between, having covered social media and looking at some of these policies in VR. I have seen differences in the wording of like what's allowed. Like, for example, in VR, something I've seen is like, don't follow somebody so closely. That could make them uncomfortable. So I do see differences, but it's also sort of obvious to me that having rules sometimes is not enough, because even in Echo VR, there are codes of conduct, and they say like it basically says like, don't be a horrible person. Every time you go into these spaces, it's like, don't be a horrible person. It's all written, But like as we were saying before, like people need to lead by example, and maybe as more healthy players enter these spaces, that will matter more than rules written on the page. And honestly, policy is constantly evolving. It changes all the time. Having covered politics before, little tweaks here and there. But is anyone really reading like all these rules? I don't think so,
Can I tell you a fun game to play at your next family Thanksgiving? So in any group of people that are gathered, about, oh gosh, I have amnesia. I think it's about 10 out of 100. So, 10% of people will show signs of clinical sociopathy. So that makes sense in your Thanksgiving, right? But it's only 3% of people that are deeply clinical. So really like your dyed-in-the-wool trolls, or people who go out to actively be malicious and harm people. When you think about content moderation regimes like that, and on other platforms, like I think on Twitter, 80% of people who violate the rules are doing it for the first time. So it's not, so user misbehavior actually isn't the norm. It's just a very outspoken minority that has an outsized impact on the culture that you have online. So I always ask companies, are you designing your rules for the 97% of people, or are you designing them for the 3% of people? And where does the burden lie? And what sort of mechanisms are you using for the 10%, or I guess the 7% of people who may need some more guidance? What does traffic school look like? So you don't lose users, you actually guide them back to your platform.
So I think we have time for one more question from the audience.
I feel like most of what you've been talking about it falls a little bit under the umbrella of like adults in these spaces, and I'm curious what you think specifically about like under 13 users, but also 13 to 18 users, and the necessity of having policy variation and content control variation for users of varied ages, especially where we're talking about under 13 users, which are technically like excluded under like violation of terms because they are like not technically even like allowed on most of these platforms, but we know that there's a large percentage of users that fall into that category anyway, right? So.
Right. Doug, were you here at 1:35 when Kavya and Kai talked about this exact thing? You have to watch that talk. So anybody who wasn't here and XRXI is putting together a framework that addresses like down to, like ages 0 to 5 and then 5 to 13. And then Kai talked about her experience like creating VR for school and talking about, or for school children, and building up the scaffolding for that. And I think they, like between the two of them, if you can even find them later today, if anybody here is interested in talking about children's safety in VR, like I think they spoke so knowledgeably about it. I don't, like maybe, I'm not gonna add anything else to what they said.
I've seen companies almost like gamify, like learning about certain policies, like Twitter, like introduced a game to learn about, I think it was privacy. So that might be something that appeals to kids, just because if you make everything a game, then it's fun for them to learn. But I definitely have seen, and it's hard to tell too if these users are actually underage, because I was hearing from other VR users that there are a lot of underage kids in these spaces, and I asked them, well, how do you know? And they said people would proclaim that they're like 6 years old. And at first I didn't really believe it, but then it happened to me where I was in a lobby in Echo VR, and there was somebody who proclaimed they were 6 years old, and they sounded like a kid. So I don't know how they got on the platform, but there are definitely underage users who proclaim on these platforms that they are actually underage.
I think Meta's done good things with parental controls and really sort of set that.
Yeah, so I think first educating parents on the technology is one of the biggest factors I think is going to play a role as the metaverse develops, but also like monitoring what your children are doing. I think you mentioned, but Quest is only supposed to be used by people that are age 13 and above. But in any event that people do buy these headsets for their kids, we are rolling out parental supervision tools, which basically is designed to encourage conversations between parents and their children, and basically allows you to monitor their screen time. And these are rolling out really soon. So we believe those are going to be tools that help at least protect kids on the Quest platform writ large.
Right. Well, thank you so much for the panel today and for the amazing insights. I'm so glad that you were here. So I'd love a round of applause again for our speakers.